He watched her eyes change before she even finished her coffee. The polite smile faded first, then the curiosity, and finally the warmth. By the time she glanced at her phone for the third time, he already knew the verdict. Rejected. Again. The word echoed in his chest louder than the clinking cups around him. He had faced tougher nights, hospital corridors, feverish cries at 2 a.m., empty beds that felt too wide, but somehow this quiet rejection in a crowded cafe hurt in a different way. It wasn't just about him. It felt like the world was rejecting the idea that a single father could still be worthy of love. If you believe in kindness, second chances, and the quiet strength of broken hearts, take a moment right now to like, comment, share, and subscribe to the channel, Lonely Dad's Strong Heart. Your support keeps stories like this alive. Ethan had never imagined his life would narrow down to two roles, father and survivor. 3 years earlier, he had buried his wife after a sudden illness that moved faster than hope. One day they were arguing about paint colors for the kitchen, and the next he was holding her cold hand in a hospital room that smelled of antiseptic and unfinished prayers. Since then, every sunrise had been both a blessing and a burden. He woke before dawn to prepare breakfast, braid his 6-year-old daughter Lily's hair with clumsy fingers, pack her lunch, and then rush to work at the small auto repair shop he had inherited from his uncle. By evening, he returned home to help with homework, cook dinner, wash dishes, and tuck her into bed with stories that often ended before he did. He had mastered survival, but he had forgotten how to live. Friends told him it was time to move on. As if grief were a location you could simply leave behind. They insisted he deserved companionship, that Lily needed a maternal presence, that loneliness was not noble, it was just lonely. After months of resistance, he finally agreed to a blind date arranged by a coworker's wife. The woman's name was Vanessa, described as sweet, understanding, open-minded. He held onto those words as he ironed his only good shirt and asked his neighbor to watch Lily for a few hours. The cafe was warm and softly lit, filled with the low murmur of conversations and the scent of roasted coffee beans. Ethan arrived early, nerves tying invisible knots in his stomach. When Vanessa walked in, she looked elegant and confident, her presence drawing subtle glances from nearby tables. At first, things seemed hopeful. She asked about his job, his hobbies, his life. He answered honestly, carefully. And then she asked if he had children. The question felt heavier than it should have. He smiled and told her about Lily, how she loved drawing rainbows, how she insisted on wearing mismatched socks, how she believed her mother had become a star that blinked just for her. Vanessa's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. She nodded slowly, her fingers tightening around her cup. The conversation began to lose its rhythm. She asked practical questions next, about custody, about how often Lily stayed with him, about how he managed his time. When he gently explained that Lily stayed with him all the time because her mother had passed away, the air seemed to thin between them. Sympathy flickered across Vanessa's face, but it was followed by something else. Hesitation. Distance. Within 30 minutes, she apologized and said she didn't think she was ready for something so complicated. She wished him well, said he seemed like a wonderful father, and left before her coffee cooled. Ethan sat there long after she was gone, staring at the empty chair. Complicated. The word clung to him like a stain. Was loving his daughter a complication? Was carrying grief an inconvenience? He lowered his gaze, embarrassed not by her rejection but by the sting in his own eyes. He had promised himself he wouldn't expect too much. Yet hope had slipped in quietly, and now it retreated, leaving behind a familiar ache. He reached for his jacket, ready to leave, when he noticed someone watching him from a table near the window. She wasn't staring rudely. It was more like she had witnessed something fragile and was unsure whether to look away or lean closer. Her name, he would later learn, was Claire. At that moment, she was simply a stranger with observant eyes and a book resting unopened beside her coffee. She had seen Vanessa leave in a hurry. She had seen the way Ethan's shoulders sagged afterward. And something in that quiet defeat felt achingly familiar. Claire was not new to disappointment. 2 years earlier, she had ended an engagement when she realized love without respect was just a performance. Since then, she had built a careful life, stable job at a community library, small apartment filled with plants, evenings spent reading or volunteering at a children's literacy program. She had promised herself she would never settle for less than sincerity. Yet sincerity, she was learning, was rare. When Ethan stood up to leave, he accidentally brushed against her table, nearly knocking over her book. He apologized immediately, his voice gentle despite the heaviness in his chest. She reassured him it was fine, and for a brief second, their eyes met fully. In that glance, there was no judgment. Only curiosity. What happened next was not dramatic. There was no cinematic music, no grand gesture. Claire simply asked if he was okay. It was such a simple question, yet it carried more warmth than the entire date he had just endured. Ethan hesitated, then offered a small, honest smile. He admitted it hadn't gone as planned. Claire nodded, as if she understood the language of quiet heartbreak. They ended up sitting for another hour. Not as a planned date, but as two strangers sharing stories. Ethan spoke about Lily, about learning to pack lunches shaped like animals, about reading bedtime stories with different voices. Claire listened with a softness that felt different from pity. When she laughed at his story about burning pancakes on his first attempt at solo parenting, it wasn't mocking, it was admiring. What surprised Ethan most was that Claire didn't flinch at the mention of his daughter. She didn't ask about complications or time constraints. Instead, she asked what Lily liked to read. She told him about the children's section at the library and how kids often gravitated towards stories about brave little heroes. There was something steady about her presence, something that didn't rush to evaluate or retreat. Over the next few weeks, they met again, sometimes for coffee, sometimes for a walk in the park where Lily liked to feed ducks. Claire met Lily on a bright Saturday afternoon. Ethan had been nervous, terrified that another rejection would cut deeper this time because it would involve his daughter. But Claire knelt to Lily's level, admired her mismatched socks, and asked about the star that blinked just for her. Lily, who was usually shy around new people, began talking animatedly about constellations she had invented. Trust did not bloom overnight. Ethan carried fear like a shadow. He worried about exposing Lily to attachment and potential loss again. He worried about whether he himself was capable of loving without betraying the memory of his late wife. Some nights he lay awake, staring at the ceiling, torn between guilt and longing. Claire, sensing his inner conflict, never pushed. She moved at his pace, offering presence instead of pressure. The real turning point came one evening when Lily fell ill with a high fever. Ethan panicked, memories of hospital corridors rushing back like a storm. He texted Claire only to cancel their dinner plans, but she showed up at his door with soup and children's medicine anyway. She didn't try to take control. She simply sat beside Lily's bed, placing a cool cloth on her forehead while Ethan called the doctor. In that quiet room, under the dim glow of a night lamp, Ethan felt something shift. Love, he realized, was not about grand declarations. It was about who stayed when fear returned. Months passed, and the café where he had once been rejected became a symbol of something entirely different. One afternoon, Ethan suggested they sit at the same table where he had faced Vanessa's dismissal. Claire agreed without hesitation. As they settled in, he confessed how small he had felt that day, how he had almost decided that love was no longer meant for him. Claire reached across the table and reminded him that rejection often clears the wrong path so the right one can appear. If Vanessa had not left, he might never have noticed the woman sitting one table away. Ethan looked around the café, realizing how thin the line was between despair and destiny. He had walked in that evening believing he was too complicated, too burdened, too late. Yet love had been quietly waiting nearby, patient and unafraid. Eventually, their story grew into something steady and undeniable. Claire didn't replace Lily's mother, and she never tried to. Instead, she became another source of warmth, another steady light in their small home. Ethan learned that loving again did not erase the past, it honored it by choosing joy despite it. He stopped seeing himself as damaged goods and began to see himself as resilient. On a cool autumn evening, as leaves painted the sidewalk in gold and crimson, Ethan took Lily's hand and walked with Claire through the park. Lily ran ahead, chasing falling leaves, her laughter bright against the fading light. Ethan felt a peace he hadn't known in years. Not because life had become perfect, but because it had become shared. If this story has touched your heart, if you have ever felt rejected, complicated, or unworthy of love, take a moment to engage with this video. Like it, share it, and subscribe to Lonely Dad's Strong Heart to support more stories that remind us we are never as alone as we think. And before this story ends, I have a special request for you. Comment the word, second chance, below if you believe love can find us even after heartbreak. That night, as Ethan tucked Lily into bed, she whispered that she liked Claire because she made their house feel brighter. Ethan stepped outside afterward, looking up at the stars. One of them blinked softly, just as Lily had always believed. He smiled, not with the desperate hope of a man seeking rescue, but with the quiet gratitude of someone who had survived the storm and found warmth again. He had been rejected at one table. But love had been sitting just one table away, waiting patiently for him to look up.